Hello, my name is Muir Laws. I'm a wildlife biologist, an artist, and an explorer. And I want to share with you several aspects of what I see in this work by Tony Foster. This is a sunset drawing. And I want to let you know how crazy difficult sunset drawings are to do. You've seen lots of sunset drawings, and very often they don't really look like a sunset. And why is that? The reason is that the real sun coming down by the horizon can do things that are impossible, yes, impossible to do, to reproduce with film or with paint or with any other medium. We cannot create on paper what the sunset does. And so what you have to do is come up with some way of still having us get the sunset experience by looking at it. So here's what the sunset can really do that we can't do. The sun is the brightest thing out there. And it can also have color in it. So if you've ever seen a orange or red sun setting over the horizon, the minute you get in there and you paint orange into it, you now have put a darker value on that white piece of paper. The thing that is the brightest thing that will blind you if you stare right at it is now that middle shade of orange. So that means you then, what can you do? If you were to really be the sunset, you'd have light streaming out of your piece of paper, and looking at it, you would go blind. Right? We can't do that. So the minute you paint that orange, you then have to make everything in the painting so much darker to adjust for that. And so there's some strategies that you can use to try to get a sense of sunsetness. And this painting here, I think, is a really wonderful balance of those. So there are several things that are done really intentionally, and I want to point out what those are. So first of all, the sun itself, which may in that moment have actually had color to it, if you put that in, it's going to force you then to make everything else super dark. So that's left bright white. And you also, what you want to do is that sun is going to feel bright because other things around it are darker. So to have that sun be bright, you need to make other things in the painting darker. So if you kind of squint at this, your brain will actually pick up the values a little bit differently. Look at how much it's actually bringing a lot of darkness into the clouds, into the sky here, and here right along the horizon. That's this critical point where light meets dark, and he needs that to really show you the difference in values. So right there, you've got along the horizon, he's made this choice to make that zone in there really, really dark. So that's critical to make the sun feel bright. So and then instead of putting color into the sun, he's put it into the sky all around. So there are purples and blues and yellows, oranges, all those colors happening in the sky. This is also an incredibly challenging thing to do, because the minute you get more of those colors into your sky, it's really easy for them to turn muddy. So if I have my yellow and purple together, if those blend together, it makes a brown. And then I've got brown in my sky. If I take orange and blue and I mix those together, I've got brown again. So putting those colors in there, you have to be very deliberate about where you are placing those. Otherwise, this beautiful spectacle of sky turns brown on you. And then another challenge is that the sunset is constantly changing, 1 minute to another. This was painted close to the equator. And at the equator, the sun comes down straight into the ocean. If you go to a high latitude and you watch a sunset, what you'll see is the sun will track across the sky as it goes down like that. But on the equator, it goes right down. So you don't have much time, and it also means that the colors in the sky are going to change. So the minute you kind of look up, you say, oh, look at those clouds and those colors in the sky, you put them down on your paper, you look up again, the sky has now changed. And if you then go like, oh, that's now blue, and you add that in, boom, there's mud on your page. So you're right on the equator, and so this is where those changes are going to happen the fastest. And So those are constraints that you have. Let's take a look at some of the really interesting solutions to kind of make this work. We already sort of mentioned this idea of contrast right up here around where the sun is. So the sun, you're going to leave that bright white, and then along the horizon here, you're going to punch up the value of that so that that sky feels bright in contrast. Then you're putting in gradients. So if you look here, the water goes from a purple into a yellow-green into this wonderful turquoisey color at the bottom. So there's this gradient here. With watercolor, you're doing that what's called wet and wet, which means that the paper is damp, and so when you put in your purple and then your next color here, they will slightly blend into each other and not leave a hard edge. But you have to really know your paints well, because some paints, when they dry, will leave little lines where those two things meet. So getting a smooth gradient that doesn't just change from one color into another, but three color changes, this purple, yellow-green, and then this blue-green at the bottom. That little transition, it's really, really subtle, it's smooth, and it works. So as the artist in me is kind of going, nice graded wash there. So then you let that dry completely, and you want people to feel that they're looking out at sort of across water, and there are little waves. So if you look, there are these little kind of lens-shaped brush strokes here. So Tony's making these by taking his brush. You start lightly on the paper, and then as you bring your brush across the paper, you're going to press down a little bit more heavily and then let that brush up again. And that gives you this line where it's light there, it's skinny. You press more, the line widens out, and then skinny as you lift your brush up. So you're getting these little kind of lens shapes in here just with those little brush marks. And notice that they're bigger here at the bottom, and then they get the little lines become smaller and closer together as you go up towards the horizon. And that gives you a real sense of depth. So by having these be wide here and narrow there, you know how when you look at something in the distance, it feels smaller. So the spacing between these lines has to get, the lines have to get more skinny, and the spacing on them changes from here to there. We also have the reflection in the water. And something that's kind of, we're used to seeing shadows kind of going out in an odd direction from the sun, but the reflections of anything, whether it's an island or the sun, are always vertically straight down on the paper below whatever is sending that reflection. So the little reflection of the island right here, you can see that only in those dark lines. So the dark lines, imagine sort of ripples in the water like this. One side of that is going to be reflecting the sky, the other is not reflecting the sky. So you'll get these sort of lines of dark and light. So only in the dark parts that's reflecting back towards those islands is he going to show the reflection vertically below those islands. And here you have the reflection of the sun vertically below that. And he's actually taking a knife and scraping out some of the paint to give you these bright white, the bright white of the paper. You have to wait till the paper is totally dry. Then you get your knife in there, you can pick out some of those reflections right in that area. That gives you that wonderful kind of shimmer on the water. Just a couple other things for the sense of place that I'm feeling in this. Is here we've got these gradations here. You notice another gradation here in the sky. Look at the gradation that he made by collecting different little particles of broken shells along the strand. And then assembled those here into this wonderful white to yellow to orange to purple brown, this gradation from the sand in the place where he is. The last little thing for your sense of place, here is a little underwater sketch of one of the fish that he saw in this same location. And I'm guessing that it is an underwater sketch because it's done on a sheet of plastic film. And that's the sort of film that Tony Foster brings with him when he goes with his scuba tanks down underwater. He'll do sketching down there on this little sheet of plastic film. So that's watercolor paper. That's a sheet of drafting film. So I'm thinking that that was done underwater. Just gives you this sense of what is going on in this place. The last thing that I want to notice is one other kind of subtlety with what is happening with the water that makes it feel so much more tropical to me. This color in the water, when you look down into tropical water, when there is white sand, white coral sand below you, you get this luminescent green color coming up, this color that you see right there on the bottom. But then, as you bring your eye closer to the horizon, instead of your eye piercing down into the water, the closer you get to the horizon, the more that the distant horizon water is reflecting the sky. So out there, towards the horizon, you're getting reflected and color, and when you look down close to you, you have this zone where you're looking at light that is sort of transmitted into the water. And you see that right here, just this, what I think is just a masterful job of, I get the feeling I've been looking down deep into this turquoise water here, and then up towards the reflected zone there. And in spite of the challenges of having to handle to draw a sunset, all those pieces come together. Even though it is impossible for anyone with any medium to accurately represent a sunset, taking the time to do this will both celebrate that moment and will also etch that moment into your mind in a way that no other practice will do. Our brains are not set up to remember the beautiful moments around us. We can immediately remember trauma, but I've often heard people look out at a sunset and say to another person, like, you know, I think this is the most beautiful sunset that I've ever seen. But it's not. It's just that we've forgotten all the rest. But through the process of making a drawing, you take one moment in time, and by the intense focus and attention that you give it, you are locking that into the fabric of your memory forever. So, more important than what ended up on the paper here is that this moment, standing by the shore, is now a beautiful and rich and permanent part of the memories that Tony Foster carries in his head and in his mind and in his heart forever. Take a close look at this one. So this was painted 3 years later from exactly the same location. And there are some really interesting things that are going on in how this painting is handled. It's a very different painting than the last one. They're both sunsets from exactly the same place. But look at the decisions that Tony Foster is now making. The sun is this sort of ill-defined pale area in here, and we've got very clear rays of sunlight coming over that. So as sunlight comes through cloud banks, you'll get these rays arcing out, all pointing down to that sun place. You can see those then playing across the surface of the ocean here. So in order to do that, you would have to first put down a color for the background, and then lift out, wash out the areas in those little zones. The clouds here are also handled with a very different approach. On the interior of the cloud, Tony is letting the paints sort of play with each other, sort of on wet paper, put down some drops of color and let those blend into them and make these nice sort of soft edges in there. But then around the outside edge of the cloud, we have a backlit rim of bright cloud around the dark core. So to push the dark on the inner core here, you notice in places like this, it really, really pops out. Here's this dark cloud with this bright edge around it. In order to get that bright edge to stand out, though, you need a little bit of contrast in the sky. You don't want to make your sky too dark, but just notice how, say, right in here, what Tony has done is to put just a little bit of blue-gray into the sky on the sky side so that the bright edge of the cloud stands out as adjacent to that. So this is what watercolors call wet and wet approach, where it's wet paper inside your cloud, and you're then putting sort of drops of wet paint into that, and they're going to blend out. Look at the contrast of the sky and the sea. The sea is all painted with a kind of, once the paper is, when you've got some initial washes down, but then we've got these very careful lines drawn across that on dry paper. So this wash has been allowed to dry, and then we have these tight details on top of that. What that does is gives you a really different sense for the water and the sky. So this being handled wet on wet, and this part here, it's painted on top of a wash that's been allowed to dry. That contrast really gives you a feeling of like, this is sea, this is sky. Same subject, totally different approach. We really see here some of the versatility that you have as the painter of how you are going to approach even the same subject in the exact same location.